Hello, and thanks for the opportunity to talk to this NIASC audience about the idea of a different way of thinking about the learning game. I'm going to be using the learning game as a metaphor throughout. We'll talk for about half an hour and then take half an hour of good conversations, I hope. The conversation will be moderated by Jeff. So what we'd like you to do is put ideas, questions, suggestions in the chat, and we'll be looking at those throughout this first part of the session, and then we'll get into some conversations. I've called this Same Game, New Playbook. The game in question is the learning game. The idea is to rethink it, to rethink the ways in which we play it. I'm going to start with a quick introduction. When I talk about the we throughout this, I'm talking about the Common Ground Collaborative, which is a global network of educators, individuals, schools, partners, organizations, joining in the process of trying to rethink learning in new ways so that we can give the kids just a better shot at success in learning, success in life. I'm going to start with a good place to start, Simon Sinek's place to start with why. Why bother? Why take on the whole gamut of learning, teaching, leading, assessing, and try to come up with a new way of thinking about it? For me, a number of reasons. And I guess this is 35 years of international school leadership and constantly thinking about it, sort of on the dance floor, on the balcony, on the dance floor, on the balcony, and seeing growing accretions of complexity. Teachers, learners, schools, leaders bogged down in bureaucracy and a whole range of energy-sapping activities that do nothing for learning, but baffle us sometimes, I think. And I have this great passion for making things simpler and less compartmentalized, less separated. You see the silos, the gaps between the parents and the school, the students and what they're learning, divisions in the school, departments in the school, the disciplines. So the CGC is really set out to change the game, make it more systemic and less siloed, make it clearer, less complex, make it simpler. And I guess the other why, if I look at it from a student perspective, is if we do take this metaphorical view of learning as a game, then for the kids, whatever else they play, learning is really the only game in town. It's the one that counts. It's the one that will determine their futures. And I envision a game where every child, every day is the most valuable player. Every kid feels like the MVP because they are in their own world to their parents, and they should be to us. And speaking of parents, watching parents bewildered by the jargon of education, the complexity of education, never really being able to participate. However much we talk about parents as partners, you rarely see that truly activated. And along with the game idea, every teacher a coach, every group of kids a learning team, working together to learn, just as teams do, supporting each other. And the teacher knowing every kid like a good sports coach knows every kid in the team, getting the best out of them, knowing their performances, knowing how they operate. So learning is a game and a new playbook to think about it, a new way to think about getting learning organized and systematized. So nice idea, but what's it look like in practice? How do we go from a big why and a learning playbook available to how do we do that? And what do we do? So from the theory to the practice, from philosophy to pragmatism. For me, this has been actually something I love to do because I think of leadership as macro or mega or meta inquiry. So in getting learning organized, the CGC came up with 4 driving questions. First one is, how about defining learning? How can we make learning happen if we haven't decided collectively what it is? And if we've decided how we learn, if we've done our define work, you're still left with the question of what's worth learning and why, the content question. So how do we do our design work? How do we put a program together? And then, of course, what's critical is the quality of teaching. Biggest impact on the quality of learning, quality of teaching. So how do we teach to that model? And then how do the kids show us what they've learned? Because without that, again, we haven't achieved anything. So how How do learners demonstrate their learning to themselves, to their peers, to their parents, to us? So, a learning ecosystem organized around 4 Ds: define, design, deliver, demonstrate. What I'm basically going to do is spend the next few minutes unpacking those 4 Ds. So the first one, what is learning? What's the process of learning? What's a simple, concrete way of defining learning that will define teaching? After some years of thinking about this, we looked at what experts do, and we said, you know, all the research shows that experts are experts in the ideas of their field and how they relate to each other. So we need to build kids who are good with ideas, or we need to build conceptual learning. But experts are also highly skilled in their field, so we need to build competency. And of all times in our history, don't we need expert human beings right now? So let's also focus on character as an equal partner in this process. So conceptual learning, competency learning, character learning, known to our members as the 3 C's of learning. So I'm just going to unpack each of those. One reason we separated them was that each of these has a different pedagogy, and we've again looked for simplicity. We stripped down conceptual learning into the simplest form of inquiry, connecting first with the student's current theory, their current knowledge, their current information, helping them construct a new theory by adding information, perhaps disruptive information, helping them find sources and ask questions. Then helping them check out their new theory, share it, contribute it. And we use simple sentence stems to help us do this work, so that we say that when we've done that, when learners have connected, constructed, and contributed, they now understand that. They maybe used to think that, but now they understand that. All of the learning goals in the CGC are written with these sentence stems. So for conceptual learning, we now understand that. We see that not as an inquiry cycle, but as an inquiry spiral. In fact, we think of all of our 3 C's as spirals. In the case of conceptual learning, constantly connecting to what we knew, constructing a new idea, checking it out, sharing it, contributing it, and so on through life. Always moving up that staircase of understanding, because understanding happens over time. Slightly different pedagogy for competency. When we want to build a skill with a student, we show them what good looks like, we give them models, we help them deconstruct it, take it apart, reconstruct it together, then identify where their performance or their product is against good, and then practicing to close the gap, initially with help, initially guided practice, and then more independent practice, so that they are able to, and again, that's our sentence stem for our competency learning goals. And a 3-part process for character learning, placing our learners in authentic contexts, asking them to consider how best to behave in that context in a moral way, how to act, and then to reflect on their action and modify their action, so that as people, as human beings, they become more, and that's our 3rd sentence stem. So the 3 C's of learning, constantly interacting. For those of you who know the ACE protocol, the NIASC accreditation protocol, I had the privilege of being one of a team of 3 that designed the initial ACE version with Greg Curtis and Peter Mott. And just thinking about these sentence stems and the way we write our learning goals, there's a direct correlation with ACE's focus on impact, because when you design goals around learners understand that, learners are able to, learners become more, you're directly describing the change in the student and therefore the impact. So CGC and ACE are very, very easily aligned. We're also doing something else. We think we're building experts, as I alluded to before. We're building experts who are learning experts. These are our kids with their learning expertise loading up, with deep conceptual understanding of key ideas, high levels of competency in important skills, and strong, positive moral character. The way we think about that also is because it's simple, it provides a simple shared learning language with the kids and with the parents. Parents can understand the 3 C's. They can ask their children a different kind of thing over dinner. We have a new dinner table conversation rather than the what did you do in school today? And I've asked that question all over the world, believe me. And whatever language it comes back in, the answer is generally nothing. We're suggesting different dinner table conversations where parents have the language of learning, where they're able to ask about shifts in their kids' understanding. So bringing learning into the home in a different way, badly needed, because now with COVID, etc., so many parents are having to be educators at home. And I guess finally, to wrap up this defining section of this presentation, imagine the three C's, each as a helix, constantly interacting. So a triple helix. A metaphorical way to think about that is CGC is proposing the DNA of learning. But to continue with the metaphor, a DNA doesn't live in a vacuum, it shapes a body. So what body of knowledge for these students, these learners, these days in this world? Or put another way, what's worth learning and why? And how do those pieces fit into a total learning experience for a child from pre-K through 12? We said one thing that's worth learning is what makes us human. So this idea is the way we've organized learning at the top level. We said we all seek purpose in our lives. We seek to feel that we belong to something bigger than ourselves. And we look for balance. We look to lead balanced, purposeful lives. We also seek to understand how the universe works, to see patterns and the principles that get things organized and bring order to systems. And speaking of systems, we live in a system. We live in a global ecosystem, which is made up of multiple minor, smaller ecosystems. We need to understand how those work to make them sustainable, because right now we're not doing a great job of sustaining our natural resources. We're all individuals seeking individual identity, but we have a compelling drive to form groups. And group membership, the way we form groups, the way we govern groups, our attitude towards other groups, is thought to be the driving evolutionary force in human society. So we deeply need to understand it. We're also storytellers. From the origins of humanity, as we gathered around campfires to cook meat together, to cook food together. And we realized, or not consciously realized, but as our societies became more complicated, and we believe our brains grew more complicated to deal with that and to understand more complex relationships, and we developed the power of language. And we've always been storytellers. We've also always been creative. As far back as humanity goes, we find remnants of artifacts of creativity. So we organized our content under 6 human commonalities, underneath which we placed disciplines and emergent disciplines like innovation, entrepreneurship, so that we've lost nothing from the original disciplines, but we're organizing them at a higher level. Here's an example of one of our we all statements. We're all storytellers, we all send messages to each other. I included this image just to show that we have all of this work in Arabic, in Hebrew, in 2 versions of Mandarin, in Spanish. We're working towards cultural and linguistic equity around the world within our member schools. And we embedded these human commonalities in a conceptual map of all human ideas. We decided that if we were going to teach for conceptual learning, we needed to work out what those concepts would be. So, embedded in this conceptual map, organized around human commonalities, the disciplines that contribute to each commonality with their definitions and with their key concepts as a driver of conceptual learning. At the same time, that's very abstract for a teacher. What does a teacher do with that nice philosophical idea and pretty graphic? We decided, of course, we have to work as practitioners with practitioners. So we used the human commonalities to organize a map of content, a scope and sequence, if you like, of units of inquiry. We call them learning modules, each driven by a compelling question, mapped underneath the human commonalities as the vertical organizer across the grade levels, with our learning goals spiraled through bands, K through 2, 3 through 5, 6 through 8, 9 through 12. So a comprehensive learning matrix. Each of the modules driven by a compelling question to make sure that we only deal with things that really matter. Things like, why do we fight? What are the causes of human conflict? Why learn? Why is it so important to be a learner? The Yellowstone story, how do wolves change rivers? How does money work? So what's real news? Compelling questions driving a connected set of learning modules embedded in a learning matrix. Each of those modules starts with a why, starts with why we're learning this in the form of the question and a narrative story. And then the learning goals, conceptual, competency, character, often modeled against familiar curriculum work like C3 for the social studies, like NGSS for the sciences, because many of our schools look to the US for their basic curriculum models. And we knew we had to have both the coverage of these key pieces of curriculum work with what Understanding by Design calls, what Jay McTighe, Grant Wiggins called, the uncoverage of big ideas. So full coverage with deep uncoverage. The next thing we plan in a module is the demonstrations of understanding, the evidence, the assessments, and only then the actual learning experiences driven by questions. At times in the year, we encourage the schools that are working with us to let the students choose a module. In fact, to let them design a module, choose their own compelling question, use one of our module planners and plan it together and then learn it together. Then occasionally, downing tools, the whole grade level or a whole section of a school, looking at a major global opportunity or global challenge and letting the kids choose through which lens they want to look at it. Do you want to be a scientist, a historian, an artist, an economist, a geographer? Letting the teachers choose, forming teams to look at a very powerful global issue through different lenses, and then come together to share what we've learned using our different lenses. What does each of the disciplines and commonalities bring to the table? Sharing that with parents through a major demonstration of learning. So, looks like this. If there are 3 C's for the defining learning, for the design, we have 3 M's. We have the map, the matrix, and the modules in a compelling, connected system. The map of human commonalities mapped into a matrix of modules through the whole school, all connected with spiraling understandings, embedded in modules that are driven by compelling questions. So the third D, if we have all that in place, how do we teach for that? How do we teach well? How do we teach knowing what we now know about the teaching methodologies that have the biggest impact on learning? What we've done is approach this from something we passionately believe in within the CGC. Building cultures around a limited number of shared principles, not a whole heap of constraining rules and regulations. We believe that cultures are built around principles, not rules, at least good, positive school cultures, learning cultures. Because as Peter Drucker said, culture eats strategy for breakfast when you're trying to make change happen. So we work with principles, not rules, and we co-create those principles with faculties. We work directly with faculties. We work on their belief systems, their learning experiences, their stories. We turn them into shared principles. A limited number, normally no more than 5. Principles like learning transfer happens best in rich, relevant learning contexts. Principles like learning is not only cognitive, it is also personal and social and emotional. Then the next logical step is to say, well, how do we turn principles into something real? How do we turn principles into practices? Because the saying is, practice makes perfect. We don't necessarily think so, but we do think practice makes permanent. So we need to be careful what we practice. So what we do is we take a principle, this is one of our principles, the self-regulation principle, and we say, what would be a learning practice that would be alive and well in a school that believed in the self-regulation principle? For example, learners would be setting their own learning goals. And what would teachers be doing? They'd also be setting their own learning goals, and they'd be teaching students how to do it. So teaching people how to learn intentionally, visibly, so that metacognition becomes baseline curriculum. So how do we deliver on the promise of the CGC? We co-create principles, we turn them into learning practices, teaching practices, and leading practices so that everything is systemic. Then the final question, the assessment question, how do we know what we've learned? How do we share it with ourselves? How do we know what we learn personally? How do we share it with our peers? How do we share it with other learning stakeholders, like our parents, like other schools? We decided to complement the current methods of assessment with self-assessment, evidence-based, chosen by students, driven by students, but systemic. And this is where the learning circle closes in terms of the 4Ds. We ask students to assess themselves against their conceptual learning goals or the program conceptual learning goals. I used to think that, now I understand that, here's my evidence. If it's a competency learning, I used to struggle to, now I'm able to, here's my evidence. If it's character, as a person, I think I'm becoming more, and here's my evidence. So, define, design, deliver, demonstrate. 4Ds, one learning ecosystem. Complexity removed, bureaucracy removed. We don't authorize schools, for example. That's why we work with accrediting agencies like NIASC. Simplified, connected, synthesized, systematized. A couple of final thoughts. We've all been in the direst of years, extraordinarily difficult time for teachers, leaders, parents, students. So what did we learn during this pandemic, and what are we still learning? Because unfortunately, as we know, it hasn't gone away. I think for us in CGC, all that happened was it confirmed what we'd been saying for years, that parents need to be more deeply involved in learning, that we need to make it simpler, that students need to be more engaged. So the painful discovery of the blindingly obvious. Who knew? Who knew? We all knew. We've been saying this for years. Parents need to be more involved. Students need to be more engaged. We've got too much content. Less is more. We knew it. We didn't do much about it. There's a wonderful book called The Knowing-Doing Gap. We know things, we don't always do them. Perhaps if there are any benefits from COVID-19, it will be that we've been alerted to what's possible. And that's why we believe it is time, truly time now, to take what we know and do something with it by creating a new playbook for the same game of learning. If anybody wants to know more, those are our contact details, and this video will be shared with everybody. It's being recorded, so everyone can take part in these conversations if you feel like it. So that's the input, everybody. Now we're going to stop, and we'll spend some time in conversation. Hopefully, what I've been talking about has provoked some thinking on your part. So I'm now looking forward to joining Jeff in a good conversation about the same game, but the new playbook.